Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor David Delacroix. Hello, David. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing very well.
So
And what about you?
I'm great, David. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. I've been reading your papers for quite a while. So, David, we're going to hit the ground running by discussing your piece From Polygyny to Serial Monogamy, a unified theory of marriage institutions. David, explain the transition from polygamy to monogamy.
Yes. So, um, so maybe I should first say, in that paper, we are interested in Europe from after the fall of the Roman Empire until today. And we are interested in looking at how marriage institutions changed over time and what could have triggered those changes. So first we look a little bit at the data and the anecdotal evidence. And very clearly, if you think to the period after the fall of the Roman Empire and the centuries there, for example, the great emperor Charlemagne, there at that time, polygyny was possible. So polygyny, for those who are not used to the word, it's a version of polygamy. So polygamy means that one person could have more than one spouse, while polygyny, it's one man having more than one wife, while polyandry would be the opposite. But there was no polyandry at the time then. So polygyny is one man having more than one wife. And very clearly at that time, for the rich, that was possible to have multiple wives and to have children with several wives over his life. And then at some point, when you look at the historical document, it changed slowly towards what we call strict monogamy. So strict monogamy, it's a situation where you can only marry one person. You cannot have another wife on the side. Only the children with that wife will have rights. And there is no divorce, and there is no, you cannot break that link. And say, let's say by 1200 in Europe, strict monogamy was a fact, was a regime. Even for the very powerful men, it was really difficult to avoid that rule. So in a sense, it's as if along the way institutions have changed, and then we wonder why. And as economists, we wonder what could be changes in the incentives for this rule to change. And so to think at that, we make a kind of intellectual experiment. Say, okay, suppose there are 4 types of people in the economy. You have males and females, and you have rich and poor. You have rich males, rich females, poor male, poor females. And suppose that they vote on the law. Of course, they did not vote, but you could think there were institutions defending the interest of those people. But suppose they have a little and monogamy. So suppose they could vote. Now let's think. So the rich males, we assume that they like a variety of wives. So the rich males, they vote for polygyny, always, for sure. While the rich females, they don't like that, because maybe they would like having multiple husbands, but that's not the question here. But they don't like being the co-wife of some other woman, so they would be against. Okay, so that's a bit obvious. Now the poor males, think about the poor males. So the poor males, they don't like polygyny, because polygyny that will so the rich will monopolize the females, and the poor face the risk of not having a wife at all. So you see, if there are more poor women marrying the rich, so the poor men could be left alone, and so they don't like that marriage regime. And then think about the poor females, and that's where things become, in a sense, interesting and a bit unexpected, because poor females, if there is polygyny, they have more chance of marrying a rich man, because there is more slots, in a sense. Huh? So imagine who could be the rich man at the beginning would be a lord, or maybe a bishop, or a knight. So those would be the options. So if those could have multiple wives, for the poor females, that's an option. And if they prefer to be the second wife of a rich over being the single wife of a poor, then they might, in fact, like polygyny. So the poor females might like polygyny because it gives them a chance to go with the rich. And so maybe there was a political support by the poor females of that regime. But then, why did it change? So it could be like that. But at some point in Europe, there was what is called the urban revolution. So the cities start to develop, some trade, essentially trade, merchants start to emerge, craftsmen, and so those guys could become rich as well. So there is more and more rich men. So the option to marry a rich man becomes more likely. And then at some point, the support for polygyny might wane because there is more rich men. So you see, it's a feedback from the number of rich men, the preference of the people, and then the support for polygyny versus monogamy. And at some point, if there is a sufficiently high number of rich men, the poor females may want to prefer strict monogamy, to be the single wife of a rich man. So that's it. So you see, we try to think about the feedback between inequality and development and marriage institutions.
All right. And David, in your piece, it is enunciated that monogamy was feasible for rich men because they were no longer monopolizing women. Poorer men were unlikely to challenge their influence. Expound a little bit on this thesis, please.
Yes, with monogamy, of course, the poor men, they like that because then they will have certainly the option to marry someone.
And rich men also like it because if poor men are starting relationships with women, it means that they're not going to be fighting wealthy men to get women.
Yes, there is a literature, but where indeed, if poor men really face, if women are really scarce for them, if there is a rationing, then they might engage in more violent activities and maybe kind of revolution. And for that reason, rich men then may want to avoid that case. That would be also a condition under which rich men, then, although they for themselves they might prefer polygyny, to keep the situation under control, monogamy could be an option.
And socially imposed monogamy was unique to the West for several centuries.
Yes, but then, so let's say it's about, say, 1200 then strict monogamy is now enforced, and that will last for until the 19th century, where divorce becomes possible. And then we enter into a third category of regime, which we call a serial monogamy. Now there is no polygyny, but you could have multiple wives, not at the same time, but over your life. And women could have multiple husbands over their life if they could divorce and remarry. And so we also studied the move from strict monogamy, where you cannot divorce, to this situation. And then the mechanisms, I think it's easier because divorce is costly. So you may want to divorce because your relationship is becoming bad, it's becoming a nightmare, but it's costly. So you need to be rich enough. And so when the society develops further and becomes rich enough, then you can afford to introduce divorce. And that's what we observe, because now, in Europe, the last big country to allow for divorce was Italy, and that was in 1974. And just for anecdote, a few years ago, the tiny country Malta also allowed divorce. Before it was forbidden. That's very recent.
David, I think that this paper is great because you cover a broad array of topical issues. So for example, monogamy is more conducive to human capital accumulation. Please explain this statement for those who may not be familiar with the link between monogamy and human capital formation.
Yes, so you see, so far I explained the effect of the economy on marriage, but the type of marriage has also an influence on the economy. And so we wanted a unified theory, so everything together. But so for that, we relied on some assumptions and on some things that are likely from the big literature looking at that. So for example, in polygyny, clearly men have, so the men who are fathers have more kids than in other regimes. And so they have less time per kid. And so you might think that is bad for human capital accumulation, no? So the rich man who has 20 kids with 8 women will not take much care of each kid. And in a sense, the time of the people who do not have kids is lost, in a sense, for learning to the kids about skills and so on. So polygyny seems, on that point of view, seems worse than monogamy, because in monogamy, each man will have a small number of children. And so if we assume that the time spent by the father with the kids is useful, then monogamy will be more conducive to growth. And then, of course, yes.
And I was just about to say that fathers can devote more resources to the education of each of their children.
Yes, that's what we have with monogamy.
And David, is monogamy better for female empowerment?
Let me think. So in the paper in itself, female empowerment is exogenous. So we assume that they have some weight and it's not evolving. Now you might think to extensions, to also maybe to endogenize the rise of female empowerment that we observed. That would be interesting. So maybe we could make a case that monogamy would be more conducive to female empowerment. We should think more about the exact mechanisms.
David, I think the problem is that you're approaching the issue like an economist, not a sociologist. So if you were a sociologist, your answer would have been either yes or no. Yeah, but there seems to be a strong case for monogamous societies ameliorating the conditions of women. In monogamous relationships, gender equality is promoted because the woman is no longer a vessel to bear children. She's a wife who ought to be cherished. So many make this argument that monogamous societies empower women, and not only do they empower women, but they encourage men to respect their wives.
Okay, so it has to do with the relationship within marriage.
Yes.
That's what we say. Yes, that.
And then
Yes,
there's also the vantage point of Christianity and the early church fathers promoting stable marriages and even penalizing men for committing adultery.
yes, no, indeed, the church was the main engine of the move towards monogamy. But what we say is that maybe it aligned with incentives that changed with development.
And in your paper, you also cite Turtilt, and Turtilt has done research on the impact of polygamous relationships on Africa. So, David,
Yes.
from a cost benefit analysis, is monogamy also a superior economic strategy?
So Turtilt, it's about savings. No, she
Yes,
looked at the effect of polygyny on savings and monogamy on savings. So yeah, and so you, but a superior, yeah, I would say. So it depends on which sense, but in a sense that it is sustained by a majority of people. I would say it depends on inequality in the society and on the level of development. Those are the two key points for some societies. Polygyny would be the preferred institutional setup.
David, it seems like you're interested in empirically testing these claims, because as an economist, you don't like to make sociological claims. But as I said earlier, if you were a sociologist, you would have been saying yes or no. But economists prefer to have the data. They don't like to assume, they prefer to test the claims.
But we are interested in understanding mechanisms. No,
Yes.
it's about. So I think it's more interesting to understand why it's like that. No, why did it change? What is the mechanisms? That's the main our main interest. Now, of course, once we know the mechanism, you can be more serious if you think about policy or welfare or things like that.
And David, on this show, we tend to speculate to create a platform for future research, and the academics actually appreciate it because they get new ideas, and the light
Yes.
bulb is going off. I want to see an actual study evaluating the link between monogamy and intergroup competition. Are monogamous societies really more competitive? This is another opinion exposed by some in the evolutionary anthropology community.
Competitive in what sense? That
They Their survival is longer than other groups, and they can all compete groups. So for example, in your piece you cited Enrich and McDonald. So from an evolutionary group competitive scenario, I would love to see a paper on this topic done by an economist of your caliber.
okay.
But
Yeah.
I think the issue is that whereas polygamous societies encourage broad-based clans, in a monogamous society, it is more patrilineal. In this, well, polygamous societies can be patrilineal too, but monogamous societies tend to encourage a higher level of individualism. So John Brown is married to Mary Jane. They have 2 children, and then grand and great grandchildren, and capital is formed to benefit John Brown and his descendants instead of John Brown and John Brown's brother and Mary Jane's cousin. So from that angle, maybe monogamy is economically superior to polygamy.
Yes, I would not make a general claim like that, because even so, if you view our societies as monogamous now, maybe it's less and less true because we are evolving. So at some point in that paper, we thought about how is it called? Polyamorous societies.
Yes.
That would be kind of a generalized polygamy, but with maybe more than with an undetermined number of both men and women. So I don't know where we are heading to.
Yeah,
how things are changing. So maybe one day there will be a support for another type of arrangement.
yeah, because
I don't know.
presently, David, people talk a lot about marriage. They say that married men commit less risk. They say that married men earn more. But what about the real economic studies to prove these assertions? And you have quite a bit of expertise in the issue. You study human capital. I've been reading your paper, so I think you're the right guy to do these studies.
I come from a theory background, so of course I like data, I like empirics, but so for example, think about the effect of divorce on children. So in the paper, we assume that in a sense it's bad for children. And so the society with serial monogamy will not be as good as the one with strict monogamy for children. But that is based on many studies in say labor economics, looking at the performance of children from divorced couples compared to children from non-divorced couples. But of course, we realize that those studies, they are not the ideal one, because we would like, ideally, but it's not possible to do, we would like to compare the children in a couple where there is no love anymore, where they shout at each other all the time, but they stay together, with the children of the same couple if they divorce. So we want to compare those two, but we cannot, of course, because either before they were staying together and that's it, or today they divorce. So there are empirical challenges that, but certainly there will be more on that.
That's a written point, David. Originally, I wasn't looking at the issue from this standpoint. So I'm glad that you brought it up. But I would actually appreciate a study either confirming or disputing the notion that the children of parents who are in loveless relationships tend to do worse on average. I didn't really examine that issue, but I do know that divorce has a negative emotional impact on children.
Yes, that is what the literature says. But the question is divorce versus fighting in the family. That we cannot test much, or maybe there are stuff on that.
Yeah, but
so there is a challenge there.
David, in your paper, you also refer to the urban revolution and its link to human capital formation and family relationships. Could you divulge into the issue a little for our readers who are yet to read your piece? I'm going to post it online for them.
Okay.
So what's that link? What's that link between the urban revolution and human capital formation and marriage, if any?
Yes. So let me re-explain. So the urban revolution, it's a little bit after the year 1000. So before the urban revolution, you should imagine in Europe, you had very few cities, or they were very small, and the rich people were really very few. You had some cities were organized around the bishop, and the bishop at that time could marry. And there was also a debate. We saw a debate about the bigamy of bishops. So bigamy means having two wives. So the church first wanted to prevent the bigamy of bishops. And then some of the cities were organized around the Lord, and then with the urban revolution, that's a renewal of trade. So there is less uncertainty. everywhere, so people start to travel more, to trade, and so you have the emergence of a new class of people, rich merchants, rich craftsmen, and as I said, those give options, give good marriage options for the women, and so then they might prefer monogamy because they prefer maybe to be with those guys, and they have enough chance. They don't need to multiply the number of slots in order to have a chance to marry up. So
All right.
and the urban revolution itself, you could see it from the outcome of a slow enrichment of Europe over time, but it's a very slow process.
All right, David, quite a fascinating topic. But you also have a paper on the lifespan of the elite from Hammurabi to Einstein. David, I know that there is no consensus in the economics profession, but I am wondering, why were elites more likely to live longer lives before the pre-industrial era?
Yeah, that's debatable because it's not obvious that elites were living longer than ordinary people, let's say, before the Industrial Revolution. So one example was this comparison between the English nobility, for which we have good genealogical data, compared to average persons, for which we have data from parish records. And so if you look before 1700, the aristocrats did not live longer than ordinary people. And maybe even if you want to be provocative a little bit, some would say they were even living shorter. They had a shorter lifespan than ordinary people. Maybe the first approximation, they would live about the same. We are talking here, we should be, because longevity, it's a tricky issue. We are talking here about adults, not child mortality, because child mortality, that's another issue. You know, child mortality was very high. Maybe 1/3 of the children would die very quickly during their first year of life. But so that's another issue. So here we are talking about the longevity you might hope when you have reached, like, say, 10 or something. So before the Industrial Revolution, probably the rich was not living much more than the poor.
And David, what caused the increase in life expectancy?
And then, so what we show is that there was an increase in life expectancy for the elite, so the group for which we have data, we consider, starting in 1650, something like that. So things started to change in a permanent way. And so we see that by having pulled data for famous people from many dictionaries and encyclopedia. And for them, we really see a change as early as 1650. And so likely at that time, there was no rise in income yet. So hence the question why. So we wonder why. And then our approach was to say, okay, let's put some, so many people have different explanations. Let's give some guidance by listing some criteria a good explanation should match. So for example, we saw that the improvement we observe was taking place all over Europe. So it was not just, say, for example, a British thing, or it was not just a Northern European thing, but you also observe this improvement in Italy, in Spain, and so on. Countries that would be a little bit, would have some lag in the takeoff that would come. So it's all over Europe. So an explanation should be like, no, cannot be English specific. So it's likely also that the explanation should be class specific. So it should explain why the elite and not.
Yeah. David. David.
Yes.
Yeah. Hold on for a minute. I'm on the computer, but I need to
Yes.
make an adjustment. Just hold on for a minute. The screen. The screen is dark. I don't know what happened. So just hold on for a minute. Just hold on for a minute, David.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay, but my screen for a minute, I can hear you, but for the screen is just went blank. It's coming back now. Thank you so much. I do. Hold on again, just.
And then I said, yeah. And then the third criterion is that we observe.
Yeah.
All kind of. So it's not just, for example, like someone told us at some point, maybe it's what is called the military revolution.
Yeah.
So the military revolution, it says it's not the nobles anymore that will lead the armies, but it will be professional soldiers. That would be good for the nobles because then they would not have to fight on the battlefields. But
Yeah.
we don't see that. It also affects the priests, the university professors, the artists, and all the upper social classes.
Yeah.
So
So
explanation should be all of Europe, all of type of occupations, but only top people.
yes.
And so my preferred explanation would be the scientific revolution, which changed the mind of the elite at that time. No? So the decline in the rise of reason and logic to understand the world, and the decline in superstition, bigotry, and also tyranny.
Yeah. So
And which led people to try to improve their longevity, to adopt, to think that adopting better lifestyle could matter. And then and also maybe some changes in science. Even because the challenge, all the big medical progresses. If you ask for someone to someone working on the history of medicine, that person will tell you it's 19th century. It's very late 19th century, like really understanding infections and stuff like that. So they would say before we don't see any progress, but there was a rise in the desire to make experiments, to try new drugs, coming, for example, from the Americas, improvement in surgery, and so that could have be beneficial to the upper class.
yeah, so David, a few seconds ago we were speaking and the screen went blank, so we spoke for a while, but eventually I just had to go and fix it. Technology can fail us sometimes. But it's so yes, but you are articulate. So during that period when I was fixing the screen, you were speaking, so we didn't lose anything, thank God. So David, now I can get to asking some questions.
Yes, please.
David, I interviewed Neil Cummins on the show
Yes.
some time ago, and I've been doing some research on elites. And again, there's no clear consensus to suggest that they had access to a better diet or even better sanitary measures. So again, when elites started to live longer on average, other than the scientific revolution, what was the other cause, if any? Was there also a great change in their mentality?
But yeah, that's so I would believe that, because it starts to improve for those born in 1640, if I remember the result of that paper. But we wrote that some some years ago. And Neil, he looks at the aristocrats only. So while maybe only 10% of our database is made by aristocrats. And if I remember well, he has a point on violence, no?
Yeah, Neil mentioned violence, but the piece on violence was done by Baton. Okay. Violence and elite numeracy. But Neil also referred to violence in his piece.
Okay. But the change in mentality, because you see, if you believe that you cannot do much to influence your life, and if you are sick, maybe it's God willing, or and then if you die, okay, that's it. It was written. There is nothing to do. So that's one view of the world. And then an enlightened view would be to say, no, maybe I can do something. Maybe there are surgeons that are better than others. Maybe there are some lifestyle that I could adopt. What is interesting is that during that time, the 18th century, you see many books being written about advices on lifestyle, but for medical purposes. So even if the understanding of things was not yet very good, there was this desire to do something, and maybe this view that yes, we have some influence on our fate, and that's a cultural change that was triggered by the scientific revolution, and that probably affected the elite first, before being diffused more or less in the rest of the population.
No, the answer seems clear. Prior to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, elites were religious people. So during the post-Enlightenment era, the ideas of elites were more likely to be impacted by science and logical thinking. So it would clearly explain to us why after industrialization, elites were likely to live longer.
Yes, that's...
Yeah, this seems to be... You may go ahead. I was just going to say that this seems to be a clear causal channel, but you may go ahead.
So you say, yeah, so the Enlightenment and the this book by Joel Mokyr, A Culture
yes,
of Growth.
I'm a big fan of Joel Mokyr.
Right, that's so that's it's a bit the idea that and you have it affected a relatively small number of persons, maybe I don't know, 2-3% of the population. And those are the guys we have in our biographical dictionaries, so for which we could measure longevity.
And David, during your research, is there any evidence to suggest that women lived longer than men?
We try to identify women in the database. That was what there are some now, but I would say there was no big difference between men and women. Women were more, there was this mortality around pregnancy and birth. So there was a small penalty there. But for the rest, my belief from what I read is that the longevity should be about the same. And we tried to do something with women, but it was still very imperfect. To identify women in the database.
And your article is focusing on Europe, but what about elites in other parts of the world immediately after the pre-industrial era? So you discussed Hammurabi, but that was long before the pre-industrial era. What about elites in other parts of the world after the industrial era?
But so in the data we are using, in principle, it covers the world. But in practice, it's really focused on Europe. But I think they are developing some data also on China. And But we did not have many observations on elsewhere. But on China, I've seen some stuff. No, because they have some. But to do those things, you need genealogical records or archives in which you can find birth and death. That's what you need. And I think in China they have such data, and I've seen some work on that. But I believe there is still a lot to do there.
But what I find a bit troubling sometimes is that elites in the non-developing world, due to a different level of development, their lifespan are still yet to approach the average lifespan in countries like Singapore and the US, which is over 75. Yeah, so I'm wondering to what extent is income really affecting lifespan? Because if elites in the developing world are richer than non-elites and very well can be compared to upper middle class people in the developed world, why is their lifespan so low relative to their peers in richer countries?
I think so. So income is still, of course, a big determinant of lifespan. But there is more than that, no? But even if you take a rich country now, the gap in longevity between the lower social classes and the upper social class is still very large, no? And so in the US, for example, it's just huge. But even in countries in which there is more social protection and where health is free for everyone, you still have a gap, no, of several years between. But then, is it income? Is it education? Is it lifestyle? A little bit of everything, no?
It could also be institutions. Healthcare is superior in the developed world compared to the developing world. So even if you're quite wealthy in a poor country, if you insist on patronizing the local health system, you're more likely to die. So institution could be explaining some of the variation in life expectancy across countries.
Yes, sure. But that's part of it's partly related to the income story. So a poor country cannot afford a very highly developed medical system, and hence what you describe.
Yeah, and then
Although there is there are some poor countries that are doing well in terms of health, no?
And then again, David, diet is important and it remained a crucial factor even when controlling for education and income. So because of cultural reasons, maybe the diet of the elites in some countries is incongruous with having a longer lifespan. That could be another causal mechanism.
No, sure, diet is important. That we see, I guess, very well with the rise of obesity in countries like Mexico, or we were talking about Tahiti in the French TV now, because they're hit by a COVID wave and the population is quite obese, so they face a very high probability of dying. Yes.
I'm glad you mentioned Haiti and obesity because some countries, based on GDP per capita income, they're poor, but obesity is a problem.
Yes, but but they are emerging from poverty. That's what, yeah.
But you know, David, I had Jay Zagorski on the show, and he said, contrary to what we believe, richer people are more likely to purchase fast food. the poor people, based on actual statistics, don't have the money to purchase fast food. So when we mention poor people, where it's actually a synonym for working class people with a little more income, so they can afford to purchase fast food. Since it's often said that poor people, because they don't have enough money to eat properly, they're purchasing fast food. But this is not really the case. Rich people have more money so they can purchase fast food. Then we also have to define what is meant by fast food. So for example, if you're eating at an efficient elite restaurant, that is still fast food. A burger for $200 at a fancy restaurant is still a burger.
Yeah, so I guess it's a very it's a topic that is very American.
So where are you from? France or Belgium?
Belgium, but French speaking.
Yes. What's the culture like in Belgium in relation to fast food?
We are resisting a little bit, but some teenagers like to buy some, but then maybe it depends. So my kids now they are grown up, so they would not eat McDonald's again.
Yeah, the McDonald's culture is for America and its offshoots, especially in the Caribbean. So countries in the Caribbean are quite Americanized. So the Americans, the British, and the Canadians, they're fond of fast food. So like the Kentucky in Jamaica is a franchise, but it's a bit different from the foreign Kentucky. The seasoning reflects Jamaican seasoning, and Jamaicans like spicy food. So it's actually quite good. Unlike, well, I've been to the States before, and Kentucky in the States is no reason to die. It isn't that great. But this is just a tangential point. David, so we're talking about your paper, and you wrote a paper on monogamy. You have a paper on the longevity of famous people, but you're from Belgium, and Belgium industrialized without having colonies. So I'm curious to know, how did Belgium get rich? Belgium is not one of those countries we usually talk about when we mention the Great Divergence, but on an economic level, it is doing quite well.
How did Belgium get rich? But it got rich. Okay, you want me to talk about colonization?
It got rich without colonization. That's what people often say. So I just want to hear your opinion.
So my view, but it's not specific to Belgium. I think the main trigger, there is a big emphasis in the literature on the Industrial Revolution, no? But that's a very British literature because they believe the Industrial Revolution, it's something British, and that indeed they were the first. That's not a dispute. But my view on this is that the key, it's really the scientific revolution that we talked about. So 16th, 17th century, change of mentality, rise of new science, followed by the Enlightenment. That's a European phenomenon that translated at some point into an industrial revolution that took place first in England. And then I think Belgium was following quite fast and then spread elsewhere. So for me, it's the primary reason of the takeoff. No? So
yeah, and Belgium industrialized without colonies. I think that's a crucial point. And
but okay, but so colonies, my view on the role of colonies, it's more like a consequence of the
development. Exactly. You can colonize a country because they're rich.
Of the primacy, it's I would say a sad consequence of the primacy of the West. No, that's the diamond story. So why is it that Spain, England, and Belgium and other France and other countries try to conquer the rest of the world rather than Incas or some African empire tried to conquer Europe, but that's because of the primacy of the West. And then, of course, that in Belgium we have this big debate today because so we had one colony, Congo. It's a huge land that was initially the private property of the King Leopold II. And there, the colony was managed in a very brutal way, to say the least. And so there is a lot of debate about how to take that properly into account. But so clearly it contributed to the enrichment of Belgium. So if you walk in Brussels, so the big avenues will be, I have one in mind, will be built at that time by that king. And of course the colony helped, but the main reason, so it's before.
Yeah, but
the rise of the West.
the last point on Belgium, there's an old writer, long deceased, his name is Brogan, and he argues that the Congo was not crucial for the industrialization of Belgium, neither were the people of Belgium heavily dependent on import from the Congo. But this is the last point on the issue of Belgium. My own view is that European countries could engage in colonialism because they were already affluent. And colonialism is an expensive process.
No, of course, the technological advance of the West was key in leading to colonization. But then, yeah, I'm sure that the colonies reinforced at some point the industrialization and the development of the West. So maybe I don't know the details, but we had a big steel and coal industry. So in the 19th century, maybe I would say I'm moving into no. But for example, that is clear for sure. So the nuclear bomb that was built by the Americans during World War II, the uranium that was required to build that bomb came from Congo. So in that case, one can say that the colony was more than helped to make that bomb. If so I'm sure there are tons of examples like that where yes.
Yeah, but as I said, this is the last point on Belgium and colonialism, but based on my reading of history and analysis, colonialism is an expensive process. So I'm not charitable to those who argue that Europeans are wealthy because of colonialism. Had it not been for colonialism, more than likely they would have had more money and less atrocities would have been committed in the developing world.
No, sure. Colonial, yeah, it was very brutal, in particular at the beginning, and lots of atrocities were committed. And
yeah, but no, David, we're wrapping up, and you're going to briefly comment on your last paper, Nepotism versus Intergenerational Transmission of Human Capital in Academia.
Yes.
I like it a lot.
Okay, that's part of my new project.
Yes, so tell us about the project and the paper. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that's a big project. That's what I will do in the next years, and that I've started to do in the last years. So again, it's around this scientific revolution and what triggered the rise of the West. And the idea is to look at more closely at universities and academies, so scientific academies like the Royal Society or the. And so the first step is to build a database of all these people who were either university professors or members of those academies there. That's a lot. That requires a lot of resources and a lot of work, because so I essentially use secondary sources, so books written about those universities and academies, and I'm collecting names and names of all these people. And while doing that, I realized that, in fact, in many cases, we find fathers and sons being in the same institution, either both professors or both members of the same academy. So we decided to raise the question and write a paper on this. Why is it so? Because, so you see, okay, that guy was teaching medicine there, and then his son was also teaching medicine there. Is it because the son learned from his father, or maybe got the taste to do that from his father? Or is it that the father used his position to push the son in that position, what we call nepotism? A priori, it seems difficult to separate, to see how can we tell. And so we designed a strategy based on a model to try to disentangle from those data the share of nepotism and the share of human capital transmission within the family. And so that's what we do in the paper. And so we have about, now I think we have 1,500 father-sons in different places over centuries, because we start with the first universities, with the urban revolution I just mentioned before, so a little bit after the year 1000 until 1800. So we stop in 1800, just the eve of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, and you attribute the rise of human capital to the decline in nepotism, and in your paper you
So the result is first to get up to come with a number. So about 20% of those sons are nepotic sons. But then what we find, maybe the most interesting part is that share is in fact declining over time. It was higher at the beginning, and so declining over time. And so that could be the sign that something was changing in Europe, no? Maybe meritocracy was gaining importance over nepotism. And what is interesting also is that it's not that the old institutions suddenly became better in terms of meritocracy, but it's the new institutions, because you have new universities created all the time and new academies created all the time. It's new institutions that have better ways of functioning, apparently, with less nepotism. So it's not that the old University of Bologna will wake up one day and say, now we say stop to nepotism and we start to use meritocracy, but maybe the newly founded university somewhere there will be more meritocratic.
and then these universities were autonomous, so autonomous would have acted as a brake on the ascent of nepotism. Autonomy would have acted as a brake on the ascent of nepotism.
What is fascinating with those universities is that those are all bottom-up institutions, no? From the beginning, all of them. So it's not they were created from the bottom, and then of course at some point you need a pope that will say, okay, go ahead, or a king or a duke or some. But all of them, in fact, are like guilds, guilds of students, guilds of professors. But some guilds might be more nepotic than others. And then with time changing, maybe also again this cultural change, we see the waning of nepotism and the rise of more meritocratic society.
And then remember that clans were not powerful in Europe by this time. So the absence of clan would have created a better platform for meritocracy.
No, I would not say so. So if we think, so you say clans, so if you think to extended families, like the Chinese guilds were organized along the lines of extended families. Would such institutions be more or less meritocratic? So that's a good question, but I would say I'm a priori, we need to think more about that. But
Yeah.
I would qualify them as less meritocratic. But
Yeah, because in an article on the apprenticeship system in Europe, it was said that in Europe the apprenticeship system transcended clan relationships, and you could share knowledge with strangers, given the appropriate contractual obligations and relationships.
yes. So that's my paper with Matthias Dobke and Joel Moki. We claim that, so we are not the first to claim that, but we apply it to apprenticeship institutions. But that a specificity of Europe, it's precisely these bottom-up institutions that are free from extended family constraints. And
Yes.
so universities are such institutions, but also like monasteries, for example, were also in many cases, bottom-up places without the constraint of extended families, and certainly scientific academies as well, and so on.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
the two things are related.
so David, it is a pleasure to speak to you, but we spoke for over 1 hour, so I have to wrap up. People like shorter conversation, but I enjoyed our discussion. Bye.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. All right,
Me
David.
too. It was nice.